right, well, I have 3 o'clock, so I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So good afternoon and welcome to our podcast, Resilience Beyond Sea Level Rise. As we look toward creating resilient communities to support our growing population of Florida, there has understandably been a focus on coastal resilience and the impact of sea level rise. However, there is more to building a resilient community than just preparing for sea level rise. There are environmental, social, and governance issues that must be addressed, whether coastal, inland, urban, or rural. Joining me today to discuss these issues are 2 subject matter experts, Jim Fox with FernLeaf and Liz Perez with Collective Water Resources. Our 3rd expert that was scheduled to be with us, Alec Bogdanoff with Brazaga, fittingly was pulled at the last minute to address a very important resilience issue. Before we jump in, please note that we will answer questions at the end of the session. If you have any questions or comments during the discussion, please leave them in chat and we will get to them as time allows. Liz and Jim, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about something that you live and breathe and something to which you've devoted a significant amount of your career. You've both been on the leading edge of developing approaches to resilience and sustainability in Florida and throughout the US. What drew you into this line of work? And Liz, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Brett. And I have to start by saying it's fabulous to have this chat with 2 experts in their field, as well as two folks that I highly respect. So it's great to be here with you, Jim and Brett. So I think it's really interesting to sort of reflect back on my relationship with climate change. It actually started back at my time when I was working on my master's at Georgia Tech. I was lucky enough to work with a really wonderful professor, Dr. Georgia Caucus there. He's an international expert on water resources and climate change. And he really helped with my formative ideas about climate change and really opened me up to thinking about a lot of the different aspects of climate change. And maybe we'll be talking about some of those today. And just so no one worries, I'm also a Gator. I'm a proud Gator. So just so y'all know. And that is really also where I started talking about climate change. Dr. Delfino, other professors at UF were also formative in those ideas. And then I am happy to say that sort of just continued from that time, but over the past 10 years, I've really seen an uptick, and I think it's an important uptick in the discussion, particularly on the local government level. We've certainly seen it on the national level for a while, but now, particularly here in Florida, I'm really happy to say that we've been discussing it pretty much since the beginning of Collective Water Resources. It's been a topic of interest, so I'm really happy to see that.
Very good.
Yeah, I'll follow with your thank you statement, Liz. It's great to be here with both of you. To answer the question from my side, I think it really starts with passion. If you have the opportunity to work on something that you're also passionate about, it makes for many happy days of work. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and most people don't know that Asheville is the home to our nation's climate and weather data center. And unfortunately, most people don't know that. So 20 years ago, our city said, well, why don't we work with the federal government, NOAA, to figure out ways to get that climate data out of that center into the hands of the private sector. And we established an applied research center in partnership with our local university, and I was asked to lead that effort. Well, coincidentally, at the same time, our city was impacted by flooding from 2 major hurricanes. And yes, we do get hurricanes here in the mountains. It had a very strong impact on our community. And I was also then asked to add the local flood damage reduction task force. So here was crisis meeting opportunity, right? And so I took my passion and put it to work to really help address a problem in my local hometown here.
Very good. I appreciate that, both of you. Jim, it's hard to discuss this topic without using terms like hazards, exposure, vulnerability, and risk. Will you explain those to us in the context of resilience and sustainability?
Sure, I'll make an attempt at that one. I think most of us understand what a hazard is, but we think more about flooding and sea level rise, and we need to kind of step back and take an all hazards view to include things like heat stress, wildfire, water shortage due to drought, just to name a few. Now, building on that hazard exposure can then be thought of, are you in harm's way of any of these hazards? Do you work in a floodplain? Do you live in the woods that are sensitive to wildfire? And once you start answering yes to being exposed to any of these hazards, we can then move on to the concept of vulnerability. Let's think of two buildings. Two buildings might be equally exposed, but one that has been elevated so that it is above flood levels is less vulnerable. Older and very young people are more vulnerable to heat stress. And poor people with less resources are often more vulnerable because they cannot personally afford air conditioning, or they live in affordable housing which may be located in harm's way. To look at the last topic, risk can be really basically defined as the chance of a loss. Or said another way, the probability of a negative consequence. Most of us understand risk when we think of the dangers of a home fire, or personal harm from an accident, or personal loss from a risky investment. So all of these are important differences in definitions, and especially when we talk to people who are not used to hearing these terms.
Thanks, Jim. Liz, we hear the terms resilient sustainability, and it brings to mind different issues for different people, not the least of which is adapting to sea level rise in coastal communities, because it's been discussed in the media most often. However, that's only a small portion of what you do in making communities more resilient, as Jim was just alluding to. What are some of the other big issues to address, and why are they important?
That's another big question, I'd say. So there's a big nomenclature issue, right? So between different professionals, we use different nomenclature. And it is true, there's a lot of focus on sea level rise, particularly within Florida. It's been comfortable to use that term for a while. But I'm going to talk about this first through my lens, which is as a water resources engineer and hydrologist. So when I hear sea level rise and I think about climate change, we're really only considering one small part of the hydrologic cycle. So that's why I think I prefer the term climate change, because to me it encompasses all of the scientific complexity, and only actually one part of that is water. There's temperature and so many other factors. So I thank you for mentioning that. It is very important to go beyond sea level rise, and really to be effective in addressing this, I think we definitely do need to get beyond sea level rise. And so now I'm going to zoom out and say that part of the issue in effectively addressing this, it's a scientific complexity, right? It's all of the issues that we can't possibly cover on a podcast. But then perhaps even more so is the social complexity. And I think that's very important. And I think it's important for scientific folks like us to talk about. I don't think we can remain comfortable within our scientific communities anymore. We're not going to be successful in addressing climate change unless we do so. So two of the other issues that I think are critical within climate change, one is just economics and the financial factors at play. Those are huge. We've got to figure out how to finance all of the different aspects of climate change. And we need to take a really significant, almost financial first approach to climate change. And that's really different than how perhaps engineers do it. We design the project and then we'll cost it out. We almost need to look at all the factors at play and start with that from the beginning and roll that into our planning processes. The other one, as we saw over the past year, that I think is critical and just so important, is equity, and not just social equity, but racial equity, all the different dimensions of that, because as Jim mentioned, unless we have more socioeconomic balance and more balance throughout communities, and unless we take a deep, meaningful dive there, just as we would with economics, it's just not going to be enough. So we can't remain comfortably within science anymore. Definitely not as technical professionals, but also those that are outside that can help us. We've got to call upon them and learn how to meaningfully communicate with them as well.
Those are great insights. Thanks, Liz. Jim, compared to other areas of engineering and science, resilience is still a relatively new field, and to a degree, we're still creating the roadmap for how it should be done. Your firm obviously has had a big hand or a big role in developing a national framework that can be applied at a local scale. Will you describe what that looks like and how it was developed?
Yeah, I'd mentioned earlier that, we started working on a local scale. And as we put together our local flood damage reduction task force, we realized we had to work outside the city boundary into the county, right? Where the rain was falling and where the floodwaters were coming from. And soon we realized, well, that's not even a big enough scale. We have to then look across some county boundaries. And of course, that then grew to the state of North Carolina. Well, I think that, that was happening at the same time that the nation started to address the issue. And the White House asked NOAA and our group to develop what's called the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. And the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit was to talk about, well, how do we move from data to decisions? And to do that, we put together a risk framework process called the Steps to Resilience. Well, this process is designed so all communities can use a framework that can be comparable from one city in Florida to another city in the Carolinas or a rural community out west. Once we developed the framework, the next step was really critical. We needed to make sure it actually worked for communities, right? So we were very fortunate. We partnered with a group called the Southeast Sustainability Directors Network. And these are the sustainability directors from, cities, and 10 cities across the Southeast agreed to prototype this risk framework with us. Cities in Florida like Orlando, Miami, and Fort Lauderdale participated. And as we made progress, then the cities of Tallahassee and West Palm Beach worked with us on quantifying the impacts of all these hazards. During this time, we launched a private company out of the Applied Research Center called FernLeaf Interactive. I guess what I want to point out is that as more of us learn lessons on how to do this, we need to share it with our peers. And, this podcast is a great example of that. I think we learn best from others and looking at best practices, what is working in cities like ours. And so sharing those sorts of ideas is critical for us to be making progress.
Well, thanks, Jim, and we certainly all appreciate your pioneering work in that. Liz, it's safe to say that no two communities are alike in terms of resilience needs. So the framework that Jim described gets tailored to each community, which you obviously have a lot of experience at doing. Describe that process for us and perhaps give an example of where you did that for a Florida community.
Okay. So I like to think about where we are in terms of vulnerability assessment sort of in two buckets. One is sort of the stormwater, water resources driven approach to vulnerability assessment. And so there are certain local governments in Florida that fall in that bucket where the government decided to work on maybe a stormwater master plan, and then as part of that would work in a vulnerability assessment. So one of those we worked on together, Brett, which is the city of Dunedin. And I do want to say, if you're a local government, I very much encourage you to consider rolling climate change into your stormwater master plans. It makes a lot of sense. It's just, sometimes it can be as simple as just running a few extra scenarios, switching up some boundary conditions, And it's becoming easier and easier to do that as our water management districts participate and help us out with things like rainfall. So some others that fall in that bucket, I would say that's where the city of West Palm Beach started. They started with a stormwater master plan that also included climate change, another one we worked on with Jones Edmonds. And then there are those sort of all hazards type assessments. And that is when I met my friends at FernLeaf, because the city of West Palm Beach had started with a stormwater master plan and actually a very robust sustainability plan, looking at comp plan modifications, and they realized they had other threats they needed to look at. And so they connected us with FernLeaf, and all of a sudden there were these wildfire experts and these natural systems experts and just all of these other experts at the table. And that's been incredibly valuable. So West Palm has done, I think, a few different waves of assessment, as well as some of our other work with FernLeaf. And I want to mention our work with the Palm Beach County Coastal Resilience Partnership. They started as an all hazard assessment, and they're also a regional assessment. And I think they've gained a lot of economy of scale, not just in being able to look at a lot of hazards, but also being able to work together as a group and leverage all of the lessons learned. So that's been very valuable. But then I also think another great example of that is our work in Charleston, Jim. So can you also talk about these all hazards assessment in your neck of the woods and elsewhere?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. I think some of the points you bring up are just, exactly spot on. First of all, communities are different because they have different hazards. I think they also have, different key assets, things that, affect their quality of life. I think the second key point you made is none of our companies can do this by ourselves, that we all bring a range of expertise that's necessary to be able to address a complex resilience issue. And so as we started working with Charleston, it was just natural for us to form a partnership with companies that are just like this on the podcast, Jones Edmonds, Collective Water. And, the city of Charleston now has built on that vulnerability assessment and integrated into their comp plan, into their stormwater plan, into their update to their hazard mitigation plan. They're working with the Army Corps on a $2 billion, seawall sort of plan. But I think the most impressive part about this is the all hazards approach. We may talk about flooding, but one of the key issues in all of our southern communities is the increasing heat stress on our populations. And so the work that is happening in the Charleston Medical District right now of looking at flooding solutions, but integrated with solutions for really trying to reduce the heat stress and looking at, planting more trees, integrating, those urban gardens into the corridors. It's that whole integrated approach that takes all of us with all of our skills to be able to come up with those best practices to really make, the cities, especially here across the Southeast, more resilient.
Great points, Jim. And Jim, I'm going to stick with you. You've done this work for long enough and with enough communities to understand what makes for a successful approach to continuous improvements. It's not just a one-time thing, but continuous improvements to a community's resilience. What are some of the commonalities you've seen that have led to successful approaches?
Yeah, well, I think we've already begun to talk about a variety of those, but I think first and fundamental is, getting all the right stakeholders, all the right voices to the table. And that really requires a local champion, from local government. And, I think we're all nodding our heads because every place we've worked in, we can instantly think of that name in the face of that local champion. Those are the people that, have the ability to be that trusted voice in their community and also get the right people to the table. Second, we've talked a lot about it just even in this last question. It takes a lot of expertise and partnerships to really provide the level of services that a community needs. And this is not a one and done sort of process. It might start with one group, but then as you build on that, you might need to bring in some other expertise or bring in new partners to the discussion. Third, and I've used this term trusted sources of information. Well, there's two different trusted sources of information. First of all, and Liz started this about talking where she started her passion, you have to build this on a factual and science-based approach. You have to have the right science, the right data to really create a quantitative assessment, and being able to use national sources like from NOAA and FEMA, along with local great data sets from local government. Charleston, South Carolina talks about this all the time. But in addition, having that local trusted source of information provided by a local partner is really big. If you can bring in a partner that not only has the expertise, but also lives and works in that community, to be able to say, I understand what's going on here, and I'm willing to, be with you through the long haul. These are the people that, really become those voices and become the honest voices. And, that's the final part. And it's really the view then of some equity. I think you really have to be very, very dogged about trying to be inclusive and hearing all voices. And that helps us then move from just kind of, oh, here's a problem, to here's some things that can actually work on a local level.
Great thoughts, Jim. I appreciate that. And you both have touched on the topic of equity. And Liz, I want to turn that back to you as it relates to climate change. And we hear about that, I think, for good reasons that you've laid out. But I'd like for you to share some more of your thoughts about integration of equity into climate change work.
Thanks, Brett. That's another, I'd say, big question. So thank you for that question. I think it's an important question. And I think right now within climate change, that's probably one of the larger pressing issues. And it's really become more of a pressing issue over the last year or so. And as you said, for good reason. So thank you. So I'll just start with myself, because I think to some extent, equity and this issue goes to the personal. And I think overall, as engineers, as scientific professionals, as local governments, I think we need to get a little more comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's kind of my mantra on this issue. And I'm talking to you engineers out there in particular, because we really like to stay safe in our offices, staring at spreadsheets. That's when I'm most happy. And honestly, I know that's when I'm most happy. But we cannot engineer our way out of this issue. And all of us have got to get together and start talking and really listening, and then embedding all of this in our process. And so to sort of talk more about that, I will say, I always, when I think about these issues, I of course think about myself. So I think about two things that go back to my upbringing. And one is that we always talk about within equity how important it is to get everyone at the table. And that sounds like you've got to send out comprehensive invitations to everyone, and then naturally they're just going to show up at your 5 p.m. meeting. And I think back to growing up in a socioeconomically challenged part of Denver, raised by an amazing single mom, but she was a really busy single mom. And while I know she cares passionately about climate change, at 5 p.m., she was worried about getting dinner on the table and a million other things. Driving across town to talk about climate change was not on her list. So there is just no way what we're doing and what we've done, let's say 20 years ago when we had our public meetings and we would all just stand up there and present, that's not going to cut it. We have got to do better there. And I think there are amazing experts out there on equity that are helping with this, but also it's about more than that. It's about getting the frontline communities embedded in the process, and I leave it to the outreach and sociology experts with a lot of that. People like Alec, who you mentioned earlier, and others. But there is another part of this, and that is that, again, I go back to engineering and I go back to myself and my upbringing, that as technical experts, wouldn't it be amazing if we had more representative experts at the table as well? So those of us that are currently working in this arena have got to go back in and reach back in and nurture these relationships. We have got to get more representation within STEM, and we've got to get younger generations interested in climate change and science, which I will say in this day and age is a little challenging. And it's still, the numbers are increasing, but they're still not great. I'm encouraged that they've increased over my 20 years of work, but they're still not great. Overall, women, for example, within engineering have risen during the time I've worked from around 5% to 15%. And we know that women are easily, given whatever survey you're looking at, we're easily around half or more of the population. So it would be amazing if we would have more representation also within the scientific community. And again, it's easy to say this, but we've got to reach back in. Those of us that are actively working, we've got to find some ways to get our children interested in STEM and their friends, and to nurture those relationships and to passionately pursue this. So that's sort of the other part of it. So with all of that said, it's a huge issue, and I think there's multiple perspectives and approaches to this issue, but I think within our areas of expertise, we need to do better, and that we bear a scientific responsibility to climate change, but we also bear a personal responsibility. So for example, those of us that are engineers, we do need to do the career days, and we do need to talk about climate change. We do need to go read to the preschoolers, all of the wonderful books that are out there. And we do need to get involved in nonprofit organizations that are doing an amazing job with education, and really just work within our comfort level, work on projects with the experts that are engaged on this, and really just do better. And I'm particularly interested in seeing engineers doing better, and overall just seeing the technical experts becoming more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Super thoughts, Liz, and very motivational as usual. We are about running out of time. I don't see any questions in chat, and just a reminder to the audience, that's in this venue, that's the only way that we can field your questions. But Liz or Jim, any closing thoughts? I know it's hard to follow what Liz just did, but.
I just want to echo what Liz just said. I think we're seeing some pretty bright lights. We have a professional society, the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. Over 60% of the members are women. I think, when we start looking at the new workforce that's coming up, we need to take personal responsibility in not only nurturing, but hiring that diverse workforce. And that's hard. But, coming from an old white guy, that if we're not investing in the future and saying this is the bottom line, because resilience is ultimately about the combination of adaptation, sustainability, and social equity. You have to have all three to get this to work. And so let's remember, invest equally in all three.
Well said.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that, Jim, and say that I have no idea how we did an entire podcast on climate change, and we have such an optimistic end to this. But I want to say too that I think, as you started with, Jim, passion is so important. So embedding that passion in what we do and igniting that fire in others is so important, because at the end of the day, that really is what gets you there. I know for me now, it's my daughter, and looking her in the eyes every day and feeling like I have to make this difference for her. And goodness knows any children she ever has, and all of the children coming up now, and igniting that fire in that generation. And I feel like within climate change, we're pummeled by bad news all the time and really tough facts. But if we can sort of stick to that, we can get there. I think in some ways the science is the easier part, because we know how to do science. A lot of us have been doing science for a long time, and we come from this amazing legacy of scientists and engineers that we're getting that done. But this is an uncomfortable place we're in, and we've got to create that next generation of professionals, really climate professionals, not just engineers or scientists, but this sort of hybrid professional that can help us get it done. And so that part of it is very exciting.
Very good. Well, Liz, Jim, I really appreciate you taking time out of your busy day and sharing all these insights with us. So thanks again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.